Instead, he busied himself with adjusting the fire and checking readings on various instruments mounted around the lodge. His patience was remarkable, the kind that came from understanding that healing took time and couldn't be rushed. After several more sips, Zara felt strength beginning to return to her limbs. The food was having an almost immediate effect, her body eagerly absorbing the calories and nutrients it had been denied for so long. But more importantly, Pip was stirring, more actively in her arms, responding to the warmth radiating from her improved circulation. She looked up to find Marcus holding the medical scanner again, but this time his approach was different. He activated the device and let her see the display, showing her how it worked by scanning various objects around the room. A piece of wood showed its cellular structure and moisture content. A metal tool revealed its alloy composition and structural integrity. The scanner was exactly what it appeared to be, a diagnostic tool with no hidden functions or ulterior purposes. Marcus pointed to Pip, then to the scanner, then made a gesture that conveyed urgency without pressure. He was asking permission, making it clear that the choice was entirely hers. But he was also showing her that time was a factor, that whatever help he could offer needed to happen soon. Zara studied his face, searching for any sign of the deception she had learned to expect from other species. The occupation forces had been masters of manipulation, able to project sincerity while planning atrocities. But this human's expression held something she hadn't seen in far too long, genuine concern with no agenda attached. Pip's breathing hitched again, more severely this time, and she made her decision. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her son in her arms and nodded to Marcus. The relief that washed over the human's features was so profound that she knew, with sudden certainty, that his concern was real. Marcus approached with reverent care, moving as if he understood the magnitude of trust she was placing in him. He knelt beside them and activated the scanner, its blue light dancing over Pip's small form as it gathered data. The readouts meant nothing to Zara, but she could see Marcus's expression growing more focused as he interpreted what he was seeing. The human reached into his medical kit and withdrew what looked like a warming patch, but far more sophisticated than the emergency heat cells she had been using. He showed it to her first, demonstrating how it adhered to skin and how its heating elements responded to biofeedback. Then, with infinite gentleness, he applied it to Pip's chest. The effect was almost immediate. Color began to return to her son's face, and his breathing became deeper and more regular. The scanner showed his core temperature climbing steadily, back toward normal ranges, and for the first time since their escape began, Zara allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive. Marcus sat back on his heels, giving them space while continuing to monitor the readings. He spoke softly in his own language, words that sounded like reassurance even though she couldn't understand them. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He touched his own chest, then pointed to her, then to Pip, and said a single word that transcended language barriers. Family. The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight far beyond its simple syllables. This human stranger was telling her that he understood what she was fighting to protect, that he recognized the bond that had driven her across impossible distances and through unthinkable dangers. He was acknowledging that what happened to them mattered, not because of politics or profit, but because they were a family deserving of protection. Tears gathered in Zara's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since their flight began. Not tears of despair this time, but something far more dangerous, hope. This human had seen them at their most vulnerable and chosen compassion over caution. He had opened his home and shared his resources without asking for anything in return. It was a kindness so profound that it hurt almost as much as relief. Dawn broke gently over Frost Ridge Mountains 3 days later, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Inside the lodge, Zara sat cross-legged on the thick rug before the fireplace, watching Pip play with a collection of carved wooden animals Marcus had made during the long winter evenings. Her son's laughter filled the room, a sound she had feared she might never hear again. The child's recovery had been remarkable. With proper warmth, nutrition, and medical care, his small body had bounced back with the resilience that seemed unique to the young. His skin had regained its healthy silver-blue glow, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity as he explored his new environment. He had taken to following Marcus around the lodge, chattering in a mixture of Kytherian and the few human words he was rapidly acquiring. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity they had developed over their shared meals. The wariness that had defined their first encounter had gradually melted away, replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. Trust, certainly, but also understanding and mutual respect. The communication array picked up chatter from Haven's Point, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. Transport ships are running regular refugee routes to the inner colonies now. Safe passage, proper documentation, the works. Zara nodded, though her hands tightened slightly around her mug. She had known this moment would come, when the practical realities of their situation would have to be addressed. Marcus was offering her exactly what she had been seeking when she first fled Kytheria: safe passage to a place where she and Pip could build a new life. But the thought of leaving filled her with unexpected sadness. This lodge had become more than shelter. It had become the first place in years where she felt truly safe. Marcus had become more than a benefactor. He had become something she had never expected to find among the stars. "There's another option," Marcus continued, his eyes focused on Pip rather than her. "The research station needs a xenobiology consultant. Someone who understands non-human physiology and can help with the wildlife studies. The pay's decent, and there's a cabin about half a kilometer from here that would be perfect for 2 people. Zara felt her breath catch. He was offering them a home, a purpose, a future that didn't involve running or hiding or constantly looking over their shoulders. It was an impossibility she had never dared to dream of. Pip looked up from his toys and toddled over to Marcus, climbing into the human's lap with the unconscious trust of a child who had never known anything but love and protection. Marcus's prosthetic arm wrapped around the boy with infinite gentleness, and Pip began babbling about the wooden animals in his excited mixture of languages. "What do you think, little explorer?" Marcus asked Pip. "Want to stay and help me count the crystal bears?" Pip's enthusiastic nod needed no translation. He had already made his choice, claimed his place in this strange new family that had formed in the wilderness. All that remained was for the adults to acknowledge what their hearts had already decided. Zara met Marcus's eyes across the space between them, seeing her own hopes reflected in his expression. "We stay," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. Outside, the mountain stood eternal and beautiful in the morning light, no longer a place of terror and cold, but a fortress protecting what mattered most. Inside the lodge, 3 hearts beat in harmony, proof that the universe occasionally chose to reward courage with exactly the kind of miracle that made all the suffering worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ice crystals sang their death song across Frost Ridge Mountains, each note sharper than broken glass. In the howling darkness of Kepler 442c's longest night, 2 heartbeats grew fainter with every passing moment. A mother's love was all that stood between her child and the eternal cold, but even love has limits when the universe decides to be cruel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thermal storm had been raging for 18 hours when Zara finally collapsed. Her silver-blue skin had turned an alarming shade of gray, and the bioluminescent markings along her arms that once glowed with clan pride now flickered like dying embers. She pressed her son Pip closer to her chest, feeling his tiny body shiver against her. The child hadn't spoken in hours, his usually bright amber eyes now dull and unfocused. They had been running for 6 days since escaping the transport ship. 6 days of hiding in caves, drinking from frozen streams, and surviving on nothing but the emergency rations she'd grabbed during their desperate flight. The bounty hunters had found their homeworld of Kytheria, and what they couldn't claim, they destroyed. Now refugees like her were worth more as captured assets than as free beings. Zara had thought the mountains would provide sanctuary. The scans from orbit showed vast wilderness, perfect for disappearing until she could find passage off-world. What the scans hadn't shown was the ferocity of this planet's weather systems, or how quickly the temperature could drop when the twin suns set behind the peaks. The Blackwood Forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its massive trees groaning under the weight of accumulated ice. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of search drones, their quantum sensors sweeping methodically. Through the valleys, they were getting closer. Even if the cold didn't claim them tonight, the hunters would find their frozen bodies by morning. Pip stirred weakly in her arms, his breathing so shallow she had to press her ear to his chest to hear it. The child's natural body heat, which should have kept them both warm, was failing. Kytherians were built for the gentle climate of their homeworld, not the brutal extremes of frontier planets. Her own survival instincts screamed at her to find shelter, but her legs refused to carry her another step. She sank to her knees in the snow, pulling her tattered cloak tighter around them both. The fabric, once a deep purple that marked her as a scholar of the Third Circle, was now stained and torn. Everything that had defined her old life was gone. Everything except the small, precious weight in her arms. Above them, the aurora painted strange colors across the alien sky. Green and violet lights danced between the stars, beautiful and utterly indifferent to their plight. Zara tilted her head back and let the ice crystals sting her face. She had failed. After everything they had survived, after all the promises she had whispered to her son during the darkest moments of their escape, she had led them to this frozen grave. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Each pulse echoed in her ears like a countdown, growing slower and more irregular. She began to hum an old lullaby from her homeworld, a soft melody her own mother had sung during the peaceful nights of her childhood. If these were to be their final moments, she wanted Pip to hear something beautiful instead of the wind's cruel song. That's when she noticed the light. At first, she thought it was another trick of the aurora, just another dancing color to mock her desperation. But this light was different, steady and warm, filtering through the trees from somewhere deeper. In the forest. It pulsed with a rhythm that reminded her of breathing, as if the forest itself had come alive. Zara struggled to her feet, every muscle in her body protesting the movement. The light seemed impossibly far away, but it was the only hope she had. She took one trembling step toward it, then another. Pip's weight felt heavier with each movement, but she forced herself to continue. The snow crunched under her feet with a sound like breaking bones. As she stumbled through the underbrush, branches catching at her cloak and scratching her already damaged skin, the light grew brighter. She could make out a structure now, geometric and purposeful among the organic chaos of the forest. Some kind of building, with smoke rising from what looked like a chimney. The sight filled her with such desperate hope that she nearly cried out. But hope was dangerous. Hope could be a trap. She had learned that lesson well during their escape, when apparent sanctuaries had turned into ambushes and kind strangers, had revealed hidden agendas. Still, what choice did she have? The alternative was certain death in the snow. The building resolved into a sturdy lodge as she drew closer, its walls built from local timber and reinforced with metal plating. Warm yellow light spilled from several windows, and she could see the glow of what had to be a fire through the main entrance. Everything about it suggested safety, comfort, life. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, holding Pip close, and scanning for any signs of danger. Her enhanced hearing picked up no sounds of movement from within, no voices or mechanical hums that might indicate hostile presence. Just the soft crackling of burning wood and the gentle hiss of melting snow on hot surfaces. Pip stirred again, making a soft sound that broke her heart. He was running out of time. They both were. Zara stepped into the clearing, her legs shaking with exhaustion and cold. Whatever waited for them in that lodge, it had to be better than dying alone in the storm. Marcus Thompson was cleaning his rifle when the motion sensors chimed. The soft electronic tone cut through the quiet evening routine he'd established during his 3 months at the lodge, and his hand instinctively moved to the security monitor. The display showed thermal signatures at the edge of the clearing, 2 heat sources moving slowly through the tree line. His first thought was local wildlife. The crystal bears that roamed these mountains often ventured close to the lodge during ice storms, drawn by the warmth and the scent of preserved foods. But as he adjusted the scanner's resolution, the shapes resolved into something far more concerning. The larger signature was upright, bipedal, carrying something smaller against its torso. The movement pattern was wrong for any animal he knew, too deliberate and careful. Mark set down the rifle and moved to the main window, keeping the lights dimmed as he peered through the reinforced glass. The storm had subsided enough for him to make out details through the swirling snow, and what he saw made his breath catch. In his throat, a tall, slender figure stumbled into the clearing, clearly exhausted and struggling to stay upright. Even at this distance, he could tell this wasn't human. The being's skin had an ethereal quality that caught the aurora's light, and their movement suggested someone at the very edge of collapse. They held something close to their chest, something small and still. Mark's medical training, honed during his years with the Colonial Defense Force, immediately recognized the signs of severe hypothermia and exhaustion. He watched as the figure stopped at the edge of his clearing, swaying slightly. They seemed to be studying the lodge, weighing some internal decision. Mark could see the tension in their posture, the way they held their burden protectively. This was someone who had learned to fear contact with others, someone who had reasons to be cautious. Mark's mind raced through the possibilities. Refugees from the Helix War had been scattered across dozens of worlds, many of them ending up in places like this remote outpost. The official channels claimed all displaced persons had been properly relocated, but Mark had heard enough stories from other guides to know better. Some people fell through the cracks, and some fell deliberately. The figure took another step forward, then stumbled. Mark saw them go down to one knee, struggling to maintain their grip on whatever they carried. That decided it for him. Whatever complicated political situation might be involved, whatever risks helping might bring, he couldn't watch someone freeze to death outside his door. He moved quickly to the equipment locker near the entrance, pulling on his heavy coat and insulated boots. His prosthetic arm, a high-end military replacement for the one he'd lost during the siege of Proxima Station, responded smoothly to his neural commands as he gathered emergency supplies. Heat cells, medical scanner, emergency stimulants, everything he might need for severe exposure cases. Mark had seen enough death during the war. He'd held too many hands as life slipped away, watched too many lights go out in young eyes. The nightmares had been part of what drove him to this isolated posting, seeking peace in the wilderness where his only responsibilities were to the Wildlife Research Station and his own troubled conscience. But peace came with its own obligations. He opened the lodge door slowly, not wanting to startle the figure in the clearing. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and he pulled his coat tighter as he stepped outside. The being looked up at the sound, and Mark got his first clear look at their face. Definitely not human, but unmistakably intelligent. Large eyes that seemed to shift color in the strange light. Angular features that spoke of grace and dignity, even in their current desperate state. Their expression was pure terror. The beings scrambled backward, clutching their burden tighter, and Mark heard a sound that raised the hair on his neck. It was a warning, primal and fierce, the sound a mother makes when something threatens her. Young, the pieces clicked together in his mind. This was a parent protecting their child, and they saw him as a potential threat. Mark stopped moving immediately, raising his hands to show they were empty. His military training had included first contact protocols, though he'd never expected to use them under circumstances like these. Slow movements, non-threatening posture, clear communication of peaceful intent. The being's eyes tracked his every movement, and Mark could see the calculation happening behind them. They were weighing their options, measuring the distance back to the tree line against their remaining strength. The child in their arms hadn't moved since Mark had first spotted them, and he found himself hoping desperately that he wasn't already. Too late. Mark knelt slowly in the snow, making himself less imposing. He reached into his coat with deliberate care and pulled out one of the heat cells, holding it up where the being could see it clearly. The crystalline device began to glow. As it activated, steam rising from its surface as it reacted with the frigid air. Recognition flickered in those alien eyes. They knew what it was, understood what he was offering. Mark placed the heat cell on the ground between them and slowly pushed it forward, then retreated several steps. The being stared at the device, then at him, clearly struggling with the decision. Long seconds passed. The wind picked up again, sending fresh snow swirling around them. Mark could see the being shivering now, their strength failing rapidly. The child in their arms remained ominously still. Finally, the being reached out with one trembling hand and grabbed the heat cell. They pressed it against the small form they carried, and Mark saw the first sign of movement from the child. A tiny hand emerged from the wrappings, fingers spreading toward the warmth. The relief that flooded through Mark was almost overwhelming. The child was alive. The being looked up at him again, and this time there was something different in their expression. Still wary, still frightened, but no longer purely hostile. They were reassessing him, trying to understand his motivations. Mark pointed toward the lodge, then made a gesture he hoped would translate across species. Come inside. Warmth. Safety. He kept his movements slow and clear, giving them time to process each action. The being followed his gesture to look at the lodge, then back at him. They spoke for the first time, words in a language he didn't recognize, but with a tone that was unmistakably questioning. They were asking something, maybe asking why he would help, maybe asking if it was safe. Mark wished he could explain that he understood their fear, that he knew what it felt like to be alone and hunted and desperate. Instead, he simply nodded toward the warmth and light spilling from his home, hoping that basic compassion needed no translation. The beings struggled to their feet, swaying dangerously. Mark started forward instinctively, then forced himself to stop when they tensed. Not yet. They weren't ready for direct contact. But they were considering his offer, and that was more than he'd dared hope for when he first stepped outside. The decision, when it came, was sudden. The being took one halting step toward the lodge, then another. Mark fell into step beside them, staying just close enough to catch them if they fell, but far enough away to avoid triggering their defensive instincts. They made it to the door together, and Mark felt something shift in the cold mountain air. Whatever happened next, at least they would face it in the warmth. The warmth of the lodge interior struck Zara like a physical force, causing her legs to buckle momentarily as her body tried to adjust to the temperature change. She caught herself against the doorframe, her free hand gripping the wood so tightly. Her knuckles turned pale beneath her silver-blue skin. The heat that should have been welcoming felt alien and overwhelming after days in the brutal cold. Marcus closed the door gently behind them, his movements careful and measured. Zara's eyes darted around the space, cataloging every detail with the paranoid precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on knowing all the exits. The lodge was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room dominated by a stone fireplace where flames danced behind protective grating. Comfortable furniture was arranged around the fire, and she could see doorways leading to what appeared to be a kitchen and sleeping quarters. But what caught her attention most were the subtle modifications throughout the space. Reinforced window frames, additional locks on the doors, and what looked like concealed sensors mounted near the ceiling. This wasn't just a wilderness retreat. This was a place built by someone who understood the need for security. Pip stirred weakly in her arms, making a soft sound that barely qualified as a whimper. The heat cell was helping, but she could feel how cold he still was beneath the layers of fabric she'd wrapped around him. His breathing remained shallow and irregular, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that terrified her. She needed to get him warm, needed to check for signs of frostbite or worse, but every instinct screamed against letting her guard down. Marcus moved slowly around the room, keeping distance between them while he gathered supplies from various cabinets and shelves. Zara watched his every movement, noting how his right arm moved with mechanical precision that spoke of prosthetic enhancement. A veteran then. Someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. That could mean he understood the cost of conflict, or it could mean he was dangerous in ways she couldn't predict. He returned with an armload of supplies, setting them on a low table within her reach but not approaching directly. Thermal blankets, what appeared to be medical equipment, containers that might hold food or medicine. His actions were those of someone trained in emergency response, but Zara had learned not to trust apparent kindness. On Kytheria, the occupation forces had often used medical aid as a pretext for control. They would arrive at refugee camps offering food and treatment, then use bioscanners to catalog genetic information for their experiments. Those who accepted help too eagerly often disappeared in the night, taken for research that served the greater glory of the expanding empire. Marcus pointed to the medical scanner in his collection of supplies, then gestured toward Pip. The meaning was clear enough, but Zara's grip tightened protectively around her son. She shook her head sharply, backing toward the wall where she could keep the entire room in view. Her throat made that warning sound again, lower this time, but no less fierce. The human paused, his expression shifting to something that looked like understanding. He raised both hands again and spoke in a gentle tone, words she couldn't understand, but which carried no threat. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up the scanner and turned it on himself, running the device over his own arm and chest. The display lit up with readouts that meant nothing to Zara, but the gesture itself was clear. He was showing her that the device was safe, demonstrating its function on himself first. Pip made another weak sound, and Zara felt her resolve wavering. She could see the logic in accepting help, could recognize that this human seemed genuinely concerned for their welfare. But logic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Too many of her people had died trusting the wrong person at the wrong moment. She settled into a corner near the fire, arranging herself so she could see all approaches while keeping Pip close to the warmth. The heat felt good against her back, though it made her damaged skin tingle uncomfortably. The thermal burns she'd sustained during their escape from the transport ship were healing poorly in the cold, and the sudden warmth made them ache with renewed intensity. Marcus seemed to understand her need for space. Instead of pressing his offer to help, he moved to the kitchen area and began preparing something that smelled distinctly like food. Real food, not the synthetic emergency rations that had sustained them during their flight. Zara's stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it was almost painful, but she forced herself to remain alert. The human worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally glancing in her direction but never staring directly. His body language spoke of patience, of someone willing to wait for trust to develop naturally rather than forcing the issue. It was a kindness she hadn't experienced in so long that she almost didn't recognize it. Pip shifted again, and this time his eyes opened slightly. They were unfocused and glassy, but at least he was responding to stimuli. Zara whispered to him in their native language, soft words of comfort and encouragement. His small hand emerged from the blankets to touch her face, fingers cold, despite the warming heat cell pressed against his chest. Marcus appeared at the edge of her vision, holding a steaming bowl. He placed it on the floor halfway between them, then retreated to give her space. The aroma that reached her was rich and complex, something that had been simmered with care. Rather than hastily prepared, her mouth watered involuntarily. But accepting food meant lowering her defenses further. It meant trusting that this stranger had no ulterior motives, that his kindness came without a price that would be extracted. Later, on every world she'd visited during their escape, generosity had come with strings attached. Information demanded, services required, debts that could never be fully repaid. Yet Pip needed nourishment as much as he needed warmth. She could feel how light he'd become in her arms, how his small body had consumed its reserves during their desperate flight. If she let pride and paranoia condemn him to starvation when help was being offered freely, what kind of mother would that make her? The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song through the mountain peaks, but inside the lodge there was only warmth and the patient presence of someone who seemed content to wait for her decision. Zara stared at the bowl, at the human who had offered it, at her son who depended entirely on her choices. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but neither was pride. Somewhere between caution and desperation lay the narrow path that might save them both. The decision would have to be made soon. Pip's breathing was growing more labored, and even she could recognize the signs of a body shutting down from cold and exhaustion. Whatever risks came with accepting help, the alternative was watching her child fade away in her arms, while safety sat just beyond her reach. The bowl sat between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Steam continued to rise from its surface, carrying with it scents that reminded Zara of better times, of her grandmother's kitchen on Kytheria, where meals were shared freely and suspicion was an unknown concept. Those days felt like someone else's. Life now, separated from her current reality by an ocean of loss and betrayal. Pip's breathing hitched, a sound that sent ice through her veins despite the warmth surrounding them. She looked down at his face and saw that his lips had taken on a bluish tinge that no amount of heat cells could cure. His small body was shutting down, conserving energy for vital functions, while abandoning the extremities to the cold that had settled deep in his bones. Marcus moved quietly around the lodge, not approaching, but staying visible in her peripheral vision. She noticed how he favored his left side slightly, how his prosthetic arm moved with deliberate precision, while his biological hand showed the subtle tremor of old nerve damage. This was someone who had paid prices for his choices, who understood what it meant to carry scars both visible and hidden. The human gathered more supplies from a storage area, medical equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything a simple wilderness guide should possess. Military-grade biomonitors, surgical tools that gleamed with the sheen of monofilament edges, pharmaceutical injectors loaded with substances she couldn't identify. Either this man had connections she couldn't fathom, or his background was far more complex than his current circumstances suggested. He returned with a soft blanket that radiated gentle warmth, clearly designed for treating hypothermia victims. Marcus held it up so she could see it clearly, then placed it near the bowl of food. His message was simple but profound. Take what you need. No conditions, no demands, just basic human decency extended across the void between species. Pip made another weak sound, and Zara felt something crack inside her chest. Her son was dying in her arms while she let fear dictate their fate. She had fled across half the galaxy to protect him, had stolen a transport ship and fought through 3 security checkpoints, had endured cold and hunger and constant terror, all to keep him safe. Was she going to let him slip away now, because she couldn't bring herself to trust one act of kindness? Carefully, still watching Marcus for any sign of deception, she reached for the bowl. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and she nearly dropped it when the warmth of the ceramic burned against her damaged skin. The liquid inside was rich and golden, with visible pieces of what looked like vegetables and protein, floating in a broth that had been simmered to perfection. She brought the bowl to her lips and took a tentative sip. The taste exploded across her tongue, warmth and flavor and nourishment all combined in a way that made her realize just how desperately hungry she had become. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder of what civilization could offer when it chose. Compassion over conquest. Marcus watched her eat with quiet satisfaction, but he didn't move closer.